Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. In this episode, we're looking into a case that stirred intense feelings across the nation and beyond. A case where a young man's choices, his family's wealth, and the legal system's response ignited outrage, questioning whether justice was truly served. All right, imagine this. It's a summer evening in Texas, and a 16-year-old named Ethan Couch is behind the wheel, drunk and speeding down a dark road. He's had a life most would envy, one of privilege, freedom, and resources most of us can only imagine. But on this night, everything goes wrong. Couch's reckless driving results in a crash that kills 4 people and severely injures several others. Lives are ended, families are devastated, and survivors are left to cope with unimaginable pain. In a tragedy like this, you'd expect the legal system to respond swiftly and decisively, to bring accountability and perhaps some measure of closure for those affected. But what came next was not what most people expected. Instead of a prison sentence, Ethan Couch was given probation. Why? His defense argued that he suffered from something they call affluenza, a supposed inability to understand the consequences of his actions due to his privileged upbringing. This was more than just a courtroom defense. This was a turning point. The word affluenza spread like wildfire, appearing on news networks, in newspapers, and on social media, and people everywhere had an opinion about this. Was this a genuine condition? Or was this a way to excuse behavior that should have real consequences? And what message did this send to the victims and their families who were left with a devastating loss? In this episode, we're going to dive into Ethan Couch's case, exploring the facts, the arguments on both sides, and why this particular case left so many people questioning the justice system itself. Was this truly justice served, or a painful reminder of how wealth can influence even the most tragic of cases? Stay with me as we uncover the story behind the headlines and examine how the court's decision left a lasting impact, not just on the families affected, but on the entire nation. The story of Ethan Couch presents us with a question that many have struggled to answer. When someone's actions result in a deep loss, how should they be held accountable? And in Couch's case, can privilege, or what his defense team called affluenza, ever excuse that loss? Let's go back to the courtroom. Families of the victims sat in quiet agony, waiting to hear what the court would decide. They'd already lost loved ones to an act of recklessness, and now they were looking to the justice system for some measure of accountability. But what they heard instead was something they could not have anticipated. Couch's defense argued that he was essentially a product of his environment, raised in a bubble of wealth and entitlement, where he was sheltered from the natural consequences of his actions. The word they used was affluenza, a term that took on a life of its own after the trial. The concept suggested that Ethan was so accustomed to privilege, so deeply unaware of the impact of his behavior, that he couldn't be held fully responsible for what he had done. His wealth, in this argument, had insulated him from understanding right and wrong. Imagine hearing this as one of the families in the courtroom. You've lost someone dear to you, and now you're hearing that the young man responsible might walk free because he was too privileged to know better. In the days that followed, the public reacted with fury and disbelief. How could wealth in any form be a valid defense against accountability? And what did this defense mean for the victims who would never come back? People questioned whether Couch's privilege had protected him from facing the consequences that someone else, someone without his resources, would surely have received. But the core question lingered. Does upbringing truly affect a person's sense of responsibility to this degree? And if so, should the law acknowledge it as a mitigating factor? The Couch case opened a discussion about how privilege, wealth, and personal responsibility intersect, sparking questions that went beyond this single trial. If a young person can avoid prison time after taking lives, what message does that send to society? As we continue, consider the implications of this argument. Could a precedent like this mean that future cases involving privileged defendants might follow suit, reducing accountability? And for the families left grieving, can there be any sense of justice when it seems that wealth might truly buy freedom? This concept of affluenza sparked more than just curiosity. It ignited a fierce debate across the country. People from all walks of life, legal experts, families, everyday citizens, they all were trying to figure out the idea that someone's upbringing could somehow justify or even explain their actions in a way that could reduce their punishment. Some argued that if affluenza was a genuine condition, it would require accountability from those who raised him and from the institutions that allowed this kind of privilege to go unchecked. But others asked, how could wealth ever be seen as a limitation when so many go through life without those resources and still learn the basics of right and wrong? The media played a major role in shaping the public's perception of the case. News outlets ran stories on Couch's life of luxury, highlighting vacations, high-end cars, and stories of leniency from his family on previous occasions. This coverage painted a picture of a life removed from consequences, a young man living without boundaries, and an upbringing that, for many, came to symbolize everything that was unfair about the justice system. Social media lit up with responses, hashtags criticizing the court's decision, and personal stories from people who had experienced the harsh realities of accountability in ways Couch seemed to avoid. Legal experts weighed in too, pointing out that while upbringing and psychological backgrounds are sometimes considered during sentencing, the notion of affluenza was unprecedented. It had never been used in this way before, especially not to justify probation in a case involving such loss of life. For some, the decision was seen as an open door for future cases to argue similar defenses, a way for privilege to mask accountability, a precedent that could redefine justice for those with access to resources. The families of victims, meanwhile, faced an impossible reality. Their loved ones had been taken from them in a tragic, preventable event, and instead of receiving a sense of closure, they were left with a ruling that to many felt like another layer of injustice. Couch would serve his time outside of prison walls. He was allowed to continue his life while they mourned the permanent loss of theirs. The public saw these families' pain and in turn felt the raw ache of a system that in their eyes had failed to deliver justice. So as we look back at this case, we're left with critical questions. Is it fair for someone's wealth or background to impact how we assign responsibility? Does acknowledging a privileged upbringing mean excusing the harm caused by it? Or is it simply recognizing that everyone's environment shapes their actions? The Couch case became more than a single trial. It became a litmus test for how we as a society balance accountability with empathy, privilege with justice. And while the court delivered its verdict, the public wasn't ready to accept it. They felt that something essential had been overlooked, that a profound loss deserved a consequence greater than probation, regardless of Ethan Couch's background or his inability to understand it. The case raises a lasting question. Should we hold everyone accountable to the same standard of justice? Or does the path someone took to their actions change our view of their guilt? As we move forward here, consider these questions and think about the implications for justice as a whole. In cases like Ethan Couch's, where life and privilege intersect in such tragic ways, we are forced to face the uncomfortable reality of how much wealth may still protect people from true accountability. And in the end, is that something we're willing to accept? Let's get into some of the facts in this case. Ethan Couch grew up in Burleson, Texas, in a world that to most people seemed unimaginable. His family owned a successful business, and Ethan's life was filled with privilege from the start. Luxury vacations, high-end cars, and access to nearly anything he desired were part of his everyday life. But according to those who knew him, this privilege came without boundaries. Ethan's parents, Fred and Tanya, were known for their lenient approach of parenting. From a young age, Ethan was allowed freedoms most kids could only dream of, with very few consequences for his actions. As Ethan grew older, this permissive environment began to show signs of strain. Teachers and school administrators reported that his behavior grew increasingly reckless, and with little intervention from his parents. At just 13, he was caught drinking in his car, yet no serious consequences followed. This incident became one of many, each a small part of a pattern that hinted at a lack of accountability, a life lived without repercussions. Then, on the evening of June 15th in 2013, everything changed. Ethan, now 16, gathered with friends, drinking heavily before getting behind the wheel of his father's truck. That night, he was intoxicated. His blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit for an adult. Not only had he been drinking, but he had also taken Valium, a sedative that only added to his impaired state. Now, despite his intoxication, Ethan decided to drive, speeding down a narrow Texas road at 70 miles per hour. As Ethan tore down this road, a tragedy unfolded. Holly Boyles, her daughter Shelby, and Brian Jennings, a youth pastor, had stopped to help Brianna Mitchell, who had a flat tire on the side of the road. The group was by the roadside when Ethan's truck veered off the pavement, slamming into them. In a split second, 4 lives were taken. Brianna, Holly, Shelby, and Brian all died at the scene. The crash left 2 others severely injured, including one of Ethan's friends, who suffered a debilitating brain injury that would alter his life forever. When the news broke, the small Texas community was devastated. Families mourned loved ones taken too soon, and the ripple effect of this tragedy touched everyone connected to those who died. People demanded justice, seeking accountability for an accident that, to many, was unavoidable. The police investigation revealed Ethan's blood alcohol content, his speeding, and the presence of Valium in his system, all pointing to an irresponsible choice that had caused unimaginable pain. At first, it seemed like an open and shut case of reckless driving resulting in manslaughter. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum penalty, a 20-year sentence, to reflect the severity of the crime and provide a sense of justice to the grieving families. But then came the defense's strategy, one that would soon become infamous. Ethan's lawyers argued that he suffered from affluenza. Affluenza, they claimed, was a psychological condition stemming from Ethan's privileged upbringing. They argued that his wealth and lack of boundaries had left him unable to understand consequences, essentially conditioning him to behave without regard for others. Ethan's parents, the defense stated, had failed to set limits, to discipline him or teach him right from wrong. Therefore, they argued, he should be treated differently, almost as if he were not fully responsible for his actions due to his upbringing. The courtroom was silent as a psychologist took the stand, testifying on behalf of the defense. He explained that Ethan was emotionally stunted and developmentally immature as a result of his parents' permissive parenting. Now, according to this psychologist, Ethan had never learned the basics of accountability, and this made him unable to foresee the consequences of his choices that night. It was a defense that until then had never been presented in this way, and as the psychologist spoke, a new narrative began to take shape. Ethan was a victim of his own privilege. When Judge Jean Boyd delivered her ruling, the response was not what the community had expected. Rather than a prison sentence, Ethan Couch was sentenced to 10 years of probation to be served in a rehabilitation facility chosen by his parents. He would undergo therapy, the court ruled, but he would not serve jail time. For the families in the courtroom, the ruling felt like a slap in the face. Their loved ones were gone, and the young man responsible would walk free, spared from prison by a term that seemed to excuse his wealth. The reaction was immediate, and it was fierce. Media outlets quickly picked up the story, and the term affluenza became a lightning rod for criticism. People could not understand how Ethan's wealth, his privilege, could be used as a defense, much less one that seemed to actually work. Social media erupted, with people expressing anger and disbelief and sorrow for the families affected. There were hashtags out there like Justice for the Victims and Affluenza Defense that began trending as the public rallied around the idea that wealth should never justify a lesser punishment. Legal experts were also stunned by the outcome. Some argued that the sentence set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that wealth and privilege could serve as a valid defense in serious cases. Others pointed out that while the law sometimes considers upbringing and mental health, the affluenza defense was unprecedented, and they worried about the long-term impact of this decision. If the court accepted affluenza for Couch, what other cases might follow with similar arguments? And what message did it send to other young people who had similar backgrounds? The families of the victims were left with unanswered questions. Would justice have been different if Ethan Couch had come from a different background? Would the court have shown the same leniency if he hadn't had the financial means to mount such a defense? For the grieving families, these questions became sources of lingering pain. Their loved ones were gone, and the young man responsible was not going to face the consequences they had hoped for. Ethan Couch's probation conditions required him to remain in treatment and comply with a list of strict regulations. But just 2 years later, in 2015, he was back in the headlines. Video footage surfaced showing Couch at a party where alcohol was being served, an explicit violation of his probation. Rather than face the possibility of prison, Couch fled to Mexico with his mother. And this started an international manhunt. They were eventually found in Puerto Vallarta, and they were arrested and brought back to the U.S. This act of defiance, it seemed to confirm the public's fears. Had Ethan truly learned anything from his sentence, or was he still living a free life, free from accountability? When Couch returned to Texas, he finally faced some of the consequences the public had long called for. Judge Wayne Selvent ordered him to serve 720 days in jail, effectively sentencing him for the time he violated his probation. This ruling, however, did little to change the initial impact of his trial. For many, it felt like justice delayed, and ultimately, justice denied. The public's outrage was renewed, but the original sentence still stood as a reminder of the disparity between privilege and accountability. In the years since Ethan Couch's case, the term affluenza has entered the public consciousness as a symbol of privilege gone unchecked. His story remains one of the most controversial examples of how wealth can impact justice, igniting conversations about fairness, privilege, and the role of the legal system in holding people accountable. As we continue, we're going to examine how the defense and the prosecution each approached this case, looking at the arguments that shaped Couch's sentence and the lasting impact of the court's decision. The arguments that were presented in Ethan Couch's trial revealed two very different approaches to understanding responsibility, privilege, and accountability. On one side, the defense painted a picture of a teenager shaped by his wealth, raised in an environment without boundaries, and therefore incapable of understanding the real-world consequences of his actions. On the other side, the prosecution argued that regardless of upbringing, Couch's actions had caused immense loss, and that his privilege should not shield him from punishment. The defense team, led by attorney Scott Brown, knew they had a challenging case ahead of them. The facts were damning. Ethan had been driving under the influence. He was speeding. He was using a medication that impaired his ability to control the vehicle. But Brown introduced an argument that would change the direction of the trial entirely. Ethan, he argued, suffered from a psychological condition, a disease of influence, if you will. According to Brown, Ethan was the product of his environment, an environment that hadn't taught him right from wrong. He hadn't been raised with consequences, and as a result, he lacked the emotional development and moral understanding to foresee the impact of his choices. And to support this theory, the defense brought in Dr. Gary Miller. He's a psychologist who testified that Ethan was emotionally stunted, having grown up in a life of unchecked privilege. Dr. Miller explained that Couch's upbringing had deprived him of the boundaries that typically shape a person's understanding of personal responsibility. According to Miller, Ethan's parents had taught him to avoid accountability, indulging his every whim and never enforcing discipline or setting limits. This lack of structure, the psychologist argued, had left Couch with an underdeveloped moral compass, a deficit that was key to understanding his own actions. The term affluenza, though initially unfamiliar, soon became a focal point of this trial. The defense argued that this condition explained why Ethan made the choices he did and why his understanding of right and wrong was impaired. In the defense's eyes, Couch wasn't like other teenagers. He hadn't been raised to consider the consequences of his actions, so he couldn't be judged by the same standards. They argued the court should see him as a product of his environment, a young man whose wealth had, ironically, become a barrier to his understanding of responsibility. This argument struck many as audacious, but for the defense, it was a way of illustrating that Ethan's behavior was not simply reckless. It was symptomatic of a deeper issue that required treatment, not punishment. They suggested rehabilitation, therapy, and structured guidance as alternatives to prison, asserting that jail time would do little to address the root cause of Ethan's behavior. The prosecution, however, saw things very differently. They argued that no amount of wealth or privilege should exempt Ethan Couch from facing the consequences of his actions. Prosecutors pointed out that Couch had still chosen to drink, drive, and speed, knowing full well that these behaviors were dangerous. In their view, Couch was not much a victim of his environment, as he was a young man making reckless choices with fatal consequences. Prosecutors also challenged the concept of affluenza itself. They argued that this so-called condition It was not medically recognized as a disorder, nor was it an excuse for breaking the law. They questioned the defense's narrative, suggesting that Couch's wealth did not impair his ability to discern right from wrong, but rather allowed him the freedom to act as he wished without any fear of repercussions. To the prosecution, Ethan's background did not negate his responsibility. It underscored the importance of holding him accountable, as his actions had devastated families and taken lives. Prosecutors emphasized that Couch's wealth should not place him above the law. They argued that, if anything, his privilege made accountability even more important. They highlighted his past behavior, noting this wasn't the first time Ethan had engaged in reckless activities without consequence. According to the prosecution, Couch's repeated disregard for the law showed that leniency would only reinforce his sense of immunity. To underscore the pain of those affected, the prosecution brought forth testimonies from the families of the victims, and their voices carried the weight of loss and injustice, reminding the court that real lives had been destroyed by Ethan's choices, that these families spoke of loved ones they had lost, the futures that were taken from them, and the impact this tragedy had left on their lives. Prosecutors argued that the court had a responsibility not only to punish Couch, but to honor the memories of those lost by delivering a just sentence. In their eyes, prison time was the only way to ensure Nathan truly understood the gravity of his actions. Now, the court's decision to accept the Affluenza case, ultimately granting Ethan Couch that probation, it left the public divided. On one hand, some people believed the ruling highlighted flaws in the justice system, especially how wealth and privilege could be leveraged to reduce accountability. For these individuals, Couch's sentence set a dangerous precedent, suggesting that young people from wealthy backgrounds might avoid punishment through psychological explanations of privilege. The term affluenza became a symbol of inequality, a defense many viewed as an insult to those without wealth. On the other hand, a small number saw validity in the defense's argument. They reasoned that privilege does shape perspective and in some cases can impair personal responsibility. However, even those who saw the logic in the defense's argument often questioned the severity of the sentence, wondering if probation alone was truly sufficient in a case involving such loss. For the families of victims, the sentence felt like a betrayal. They watched as the young man responsible for their loved ones' deaths walk free, his punishment reduced to rehab and therapy. Now, to them, the Affluenza case only deepened their sense of loss, suggesting their loved ones' lives were less valuable in the eyes of the law than Ethan Couch's future. For the wider public, the sentence sparked a wave of frustration, bringing attention to disparities in justice that often emerge along socioeconomic lines. Ethan Couch's case left an indelible mark on public consciousness. The Affluenza defense became a focal point in discussions of privilege and accountability as people questioned whether the legal system had created a loophole for the wealthy. And some worried that the case set a precedent, one that could only potentially inspire similar defenses in future cases involving privileged defendants. Others saw it as a wake-up call, a reminder that in certain instances, the justice system may bend under the weight of wealth and influence. In the years that followed, the term affluenza took on a life of its own, evolving into a cultural symbol for unchecked privilege. For many, the case remains a glaring example of how wealth can alter the trajectory of justice and of the ongoing struggle to balance empathy with accountability. And Ethan Couch's case isn't the only one that has stirred up questions of justice and privilege. In fact, there are several other instances where socioeconomic status seemed to influence sentencing in ways that left the public divided. One notable example is the case of Cassandra Blevins. a young woman from a working-class family who faced severe consequences after a tragic DUI incident. Now, unlike Couch, Blevins received a significant prison sentence, as her defense did not argue that her upbringing had shielded her from understanding accountability. Instead, the court focused on the consequences of her actions, emphasizing the need for strict punishment. For many, seeing Couch's probation sentence alongside Blevins' prison term raised difficult questions about whether defendants from less privileged backgrounds face harsher outcomes. Another relevant case, Robert Richards IV, an heir to the DuPont family fortune. Now, in 2009, if you haven't heard of this case, Richards was convicted of a serious crime, yet received probation rather than prison time, a decision that ignited public outcry due to his family's status and influence. Critics argued that his wealth and connections had granted him leniency and that others would not have received that. Like Couch, Richard's sentence appeared to suggest that wealth could impact the consequences faced, regardless of the crime's severity. This case highlights a pattern that's difficult for many to ignore. When the justice system allows factors like privilege or family status to influence sentencing, it risks undermining public confidence in the fairness of legal decisions. Together, these cases illustrate a broader trend that fueled the intense reaction to Ethan Couch's Affluenza defense, setting a stage for a national conversation on wealth, privilege, and accountability in the legal system. In the years since, Couch's story has become more than just a tragic accident and a controversial defense. It became a talking point in the fight for a more balanced justice system. Discussions on privilege, wealth, and accountability continue to resurface as people point to the Couch case as an example of why public perception of fairness in the legal system is critical to maintaining trust. Ethan Couch's story may be one of the most controversial cases in recent memory, not only for the tragedy itself, but for what the outcome represents. For many, this case embodies a troubling divide between privilege and justice, where wealth appears to shield individuals from the full consequences of their actions. But this isn't just about Ethan Couch. It's about what his case reveals about our legal system and how we as a society interpret accountability and responsibility. As you consider Couch's story, ask yourself, do you believe his sentence was fair? Does it set a dangerous precedent? Or does it acknowledge the complex role that privilege can play in shaping one's sense of responsibility? In the end, each of us has a unique perspective on what justice should look like. And for cases like Ethan Couch's, perhaps the question is less about one person's sentence and more about what this case says about our justice system as a whole. Today, the court may have its ruling, but in the court of public opinion, the case remains open. Where do you stand? Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there. Stay aware, stay curious. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.